Most people believe they've done shadow work because they've learned how to talk about pain. They know the words now: trauma, inner child, triggers, healing. They can narrate their suffering with precision and even emotion. But Jung warned about something most people still don't understand. Insight without transformation strengthens the ego instead of dissolving it. That's why so many people sound psychologically evolved while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Real shadow work does not announce itself. It does not try to look wise, peaceful, or morally elevated. In fact, to the untrained eye, it often looks unsettling. Because when someone truly integrates their shadow, they lose something society quietly rewards: the need to appear good. Jung understood that the ego survives by comparison. I'm not like them. I would never do that. At least I'm better than this person. These thoughts feel like virtue, but they're not. They are defenses. They are how the psyche keeps unacceptable impulses projected outward, so the self-image can remain clean. This is why the first unmistakable sign of real shadow work is the collapse of moral superiority. Someone who has genuinely done the work no longer experiences the psychological comfort of judging others from a safe distance. Not because they excuse harmful behavior, not because they become permissive or passive, but because they've encountered something most people avoid their entire lives: the disturbing realization that the same impulses they condemn externally exist internally as potential. And that realization is not philosophical, it is visceral. There is a moment in authentic shadow confrontation that feels like psychological vertigo. The floor drops out. The identity you've relied on fractures. You don't feel enlightened, you feel exposed. Because you suddenly see how many of your judgments were never about morality, but about protecting a fragile self-image. Imagine someone who spent years defining themselves as the honest one. They judged manipulators harshly. They took pride in their integrity. Then, during deep internal excavation, they discover something unbearable. They've been lying to themselves about their desires, their motivations, their fears, their resentment. The truth wasn't that they were morally superior. The truth was that they exiled the liar inside themselves and hunted it in others. When that insight lands fully, judgment becomes impossible in the old way, not because the person becomes weak, but because superiority collapses. They no longer stand above humanity, they stand inside it. This is what Jung meant when he said the shadow contains everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. And when those contents are integrated, something irreversible happens. The ego loses its favorite drug, the feeling of being better. People who have done real shadow work don't need to signal virtue. They don't collect moral points. They don't posture spiritually. They are often quieter, heavier, more grounded, not because they're depressed, but because they're no longer playing the game of appearances, and this makes them hard to categorize. If you've ever met someone who doesn't rush to condemn, who doesn't join outrage reflexively, who doesn't need to prove how evolved they are, you've felt this. There's a solidity to them, a weight, a sense that they've seen something in themselves they can't unsee. This is why shadow integration is rare, because once you truly recognize your own capacity for selfishness, cruelty, cowardice, manipulation, you lose the comfort of innocence. And most people would rather feel innocent than whole. Here's the quiet test Jung would have cared about most. When someone else behaves badly, do you feel psychologically separate from them? Or do you recognize the shared human potential without flinching? That answer reveals everything. If this resonates, don't perform agreement, just notice it. And if you want to continue deeper into this psychology, how real shadow work reshapes power, boundaries, and identity, stay with me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next part. And write this in the comments honestly, not performatively. I recognize this. That recognition is where real work begins. The second sign is the one that makes people uneasy, even when they can't explain why. It's the moment when someone stops mistaking niceness for goodness. Jung understood that what society rewards as virtue is often just fear in a socially acceptable form. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of one's own power. Most people are not kind because they've chosen kindness. They are nice because they are afraid of what would happen if they stopped being agreeable. Real shadow work exposes this illusion brutally. When someone integrates their shadow, they also integrate their aggression, not as violence, not as cruelty, but as capacity. They regain access to the part of themselves that can say no without guilt, that can end conversations without explanation, that can walk away without apologizing for needing self-respect. This is why integrated people feel dangerous in a subtle way. They are no longer easy to manipulate. Society conditions us to believe that anger is toxic, that conflict is failure, that strength must always be hidden behind politeness. Jung saw the opposite. He warned that repressed aggression does not disappear. It goes underground. It leaks out as passive aggression, chronic resentment, self-sabotage, and quiet bitterness disguised as virtue. That's why so many people who describe themselves as peaceful are internally exhausted. When someone does real shadow work, they stop running from their anger. They allow themselves to feel it fully without acting it out unconsciously. They study it. They learn what it protects. And once that happens, anger loses its power to possess them. It becomes a tool instead of a tyrant. This changes their entire relational field. They stop over-explaining. They stop negotiating their boundaries. They stop needing to be liked to feel safe. Not because they became cold, but because they became whole. People who used to benefit from their compliance often react badly to this shift. Some relationships quietly dissolve. Some dynamics collapse without drama. The integrated person isn't trying to dominate anyone, but they are no longer available for silent exploitation. And that alone is enough to disturb the social order. Jung would say, this is inevitable. Individuation requires the death of the false self, the version of you that existed primarily to maintain harmony at the cost of truth. And truth is rarely comfortable. You can recognize someone who has done this work by how they handle tension. They don't seek conflict, but they don't fear it. They don't escalate emotionally, but they don't retreat either. There's a calm firmness to them, a sense that they can withstand discomfort without collapsing or attacking. This is not bravado, it's integration. If you've ever noticed that once you stopped betraying yourself, certain people disappeared from your life without explanation, you're not imagining it. That's the cost Jung never romanticized. Becoming whole means you are no longer useful to systems and relationships built on your fragmentation. Pause here and ask yourself something honestly. Are you kind because you've chosen strength, or because you're avoiding it? If this part unsettled you, that's not a problem. That's a signal. Write this in the comments if it's true for you. I stopped being nice, and stay with me. In the next part, we'll uncover the sign that exposes false shadow work instantly, the collapse of projection, and why most people will do anything to avoid it. The third sign is the one most people resist the hardest because it removes the ego's last place to hide. It is the collapse of projection. Jung was explicit about this. Projection is how the psyche survives without changing. As long as the darkness can be placed outside the self-image remains intact. Most people don't realize how much of their emotional life is projection. They believe they are reacting to others, when in reality they are reacting to disowned parts of themselves. What they call intuition is often just the shadow pointing outward. You see this everywhere. Someone despises arrogance because they cannot tolerate their own hunger for power. Someone resents neediness because they learned early that needing was dangerous. Someone feels morally outraged by manipulation because they refuse to acknowledge how often they manipulate subtly through silence, guilt, or withdrawal. The external world becomes a stage where the psyche performs its avoidance. When someone genuinely does shadow work, this mechanism begins to fail, not gradually but decisively. They start catching themselves in moments where blame used to feel automatic, and once seen, projection cannot be unseen. The story collapses. This is where most people quit. Because projection is comfortable. It gives you villains, it gives you innocence, it gives you a reason why your life hasn't changed yet. Ownership removes all of that. An integrated person no longer builds their identity around being the victim of their circumstances. This doesn't mean they deny injustice or pretend other people don't cause harm. It means they stop using those realities as psychological shields. They take responsibility for their internal reactions, their patterns, their repeated choices. Jung insisted on this distinction. Responsibility is not self-blame. Responsibility is power reclaimed. You can see this clearly in relationships. Someone claims their partner is emotionally unavailable, controlling, distant. They build a narrative that explains everything. Then real shadow work reveals something devastating. Their own emotional withdrawal, their fear of intimacy, their use of criticism as armor. Once this is seen, the story breaks. They can no longer hide behind it. And that realization is excruciating, because it means they are no longer the innocent party. They are a participant. This is why shadow work feels brutal. It removes the comfort of moral positioning. It forces you to say, without justification, I played a role in this. People who have integrated their shadow speak differently. They don't obsess over who is wrong. They don't need to be validated as the good one. They ask a different question entirely. What part of me is active here? That question alone exposes real work. Projection also collapses in how they speak about their past. They don't romanticize trauma. They don't wear wounds as identity. They don't turn suffering into status. They acknowledge it, learn from it, and move forward changed. Trauma becomes information, not a personality. This is why fake shadow work is easy to spot. It produces endless explanation with no transformation. Real shadow work produces fewer words and more consequence. Here is the quiet test Jung would have trusted. When conflict arises, does the person immediately explain why the other is at fault, or do they turn inward first? That pause reveals everything. If you recognize yourself here, don't rush to fix it, just notice it. Awareness is the doorway, but only if you walk through it. Write this in the comments if you're ready for ownership, not excuses. I take responsibility. Stay with me. The final sign is the one that changes a person's entire social world, the presence that makes others uncomfortable without a single word being spoken. The final sign is the one people feel before they understand. It isn't a behavior. It isn't something someone says. It's a presence. Jung described it indirectly, but anyone who has encountered it recognizes it immediately. When someone has integrated their shadow, they stop performing a persona, and when the persona dissolves, something uncanny replaces it. Most people move through life wearing a carefully managed mask, not because they are dishonest, but because they were trained to survive by being acceptable. The persona is polite, functional, predictable. It keeps interactions smooth and safe. But it also keeps the shadow hidden and untouched. When someone completes real shadow work, that performance collapses, not dramatically, quietly. They no longer need to signal goodness, intelligence, depth, or healing. They simply are. And that raw authenticity unsettles people who are still performing. This is why integrated individuals often feel intense or too much without doing anything unusual. They aren't imposing, they aren't dominating, they aren't trying to provoke. Their presence alone disrupts the unconscious contracts that keep social life comfortable. They remind others of the parts of themselves they're still avoiding. Jung called this psychological resonance. When you are internally divided, you are drawn to personas that reassure your division. But when someone is internally unified, they act like a mirror. They reflect the fragmentation in others without effort. This is why real shadow work often leads to social polarization. Some people feel deeply drawn to the integrated person. Others feel inexplicably repelled. There is rarely neutrality. Authenticity creates polarity. Integrated people often notice that old relationships quietly dissolve, not through conflict, but through incompatibility. They no longer reinforce the same stories. They no longer play the same roles. And without those roles, the relationship has nothing to attach to. This is also why real shadow work can feel lonely. Not because connection is impossible, but because superficial connection no longer satisfies, and superficial people often sense this and withdraw. Now here is the paradox Jung understood better than most. Integration does not make life easier. It makes you psychologically invincible. Psychological invincibility does not mean numbness. It does not mean constant peace. It means no part of you is exiled. No emotion controls you from the dark. Anger can arise without possession. Fear can appear without paralysis. Pain can exist without identity. When you are no longer at war with yourself, the world loses much of its power over you. This is why society quietly resists real shadow work. Entire systems depend on unintegrated people, people driven by guilt, fear, approval, and projection. An integrated individual is harder to manipulate, harder to shame, harder to control. Jung knew individuation was not just personal development, it was a psychological rebellion. One integrated person breaks a small piece of the collective illusion. Enough of them would change everything. So the real question was never how to spot who has done shadow work. The real question is whether you are willing to do it. Not the aesthetic version, not the intellectual version, the version that costs you your excuses, your superiority, your persona. The moment you can say without flinching, "That is also me," the shadow loses its power. If this series resonated, write this in the comments honestly. I stop pretending. And if you want a structured path that turns insight into lived transformation, the link is in the description. Stay with the work. That's where freedom actually begins.